You are listening to Missed Apex Podcast. We live F1. Welcome to Missed Apex Podcast. I'm your host, Richard Reddy, but my friends call me Spanners. So, let's be friends. Welcome to our Canadian Grand Prix race review. That was a shot in the arm for F1 entertainment because, well, Montreal can deliver some nothingy races from time to time. It can also deliver some all-time classics, and that was somewhere in between. But at least it wasn't Monaco, at least it wasn't Imola. So coming up, we'll discuss, could Russell have won that race? Could Norris have won that race? Why did Verstappen win that race? Was Leclerc right to go on a 30-second a lap slower tyre after the safety car? And we'll reminisce about when we all slightly wondered if Magnussen might win, even though we knew he wouldn't. But, you know, still, that was kind of cool for a bit. We are an independent podcast produced in the podcasting shed with the kind support of our patrons and partners. We aim to bring you a race review before your Monday morning commute. We might be wrong, but we're first. I'm joined in the shed by Matt Trumpets. Hello, Matt.
How's about that weather, huh?
That weather was kind of neat, right? Unpredictable and stuff.
Yeah, I love it. I think every track should get sprinklers that good.
Yeah, or we do every race in Montreal or Britain in May or June, because Britain was due a summer. We might not get one.
Or any time. Isn't it always like that over there?
We had like 4 good years that teased the UK into thinking that the misery was over. But no, I think you can rely on interchangeable conditions in Silverstone as well. And the thing is, with Montreal, I defend this track a lot, and then you get a few years of dry races and people start saying Montreal is rubbish, but then you get a race like this and you understand why it's one of the classics.
Well, yeah, that, and they're overtaking spots, and you can get weird weather. And even at its most understood and best, it's always strategically balanced. In fact, I would say, and you've not asked me this, but I'm going to say it anyway, usually when we get a dull race, it's because we get a safety car at an inopportune moment, and that kind of kills the strategy. Yeah.
Someone who's done a lot of overtakes in his time is our professional race car driver. It's Brad Philpot. Hello, Brad.
Who would have thought that we'd be kind of surprised that Max Verstappen won a race? I think it's nice that we've got to this stage in the season and it's not just a foregone conclusion. It was Max that won, but we didn't know that until relatively late, so I'm pretty happy with that.
Yeah, I might argue, though, that qualifying was an upset, because he could easily have won qualifying, and had he been in pole, the narrative going into the race would have been, oh, it's yet another weekend where they've struggled during practice, but then they've pulled out enough for pole position.
Yeah, but even if you just watch the first part of the race, he never looked strong. You know, he was caught, overtaken, and pulled away from on pace. So I'm going to take that, even though the end result was still just another Verstappen win. I think the fact that we've got some kind of a chance of a fight is a completely different position to what we thought a couple of months ago.
And we're joined by our friendly neighbourhood vet. It's Chris Catman Turner. Hello, Chris.
Hey, Spanners. Isn't it amazing that, you know, this race, we've got so much to talk about. I think we're definitely going to stick to our metric Missed Apex hour on this one.
Well, we've always stuck to an hour on this show, so I don't know why this would be any different. So we're going to get into this race review, but first of all, I'd like to say a happy birthday to listener Richard Muscolino in New York. Your wife has been messaging me, and you're a very lucky man to have someone in your life who cares so passionately about your birthday. And I don't want to spoil any surprise, but I think you're set for a happy birthday thing. Also, I'm sorry you've turned 40. Unfortunately, that doesn't get any better. But thanks for listening to Missed Apex. I might be in New York soon for a motorsport event. That is listener Richard. Happy 40th birthday. So let's linger a little while, guys, on why this race was good. So I think, Brad, like sometimes we have to spend a lot of time defending F1, but this race had nearly all the ingredients for, you know, a race that could be engaging all the way through.
Yeah, so first of all, we had a close qualifying session. So you can talk about the reasons why that was, but the fact is there were several drivers from a couple of different teams in the fight. And then we had wet weather. When I turned on the TV, I could see it was definitely wet in the paddock. So that was cool too. A track where you can overtake, even though, as we saw in the wet, when a dry line develops, it's pretty hard to do that, move offline to overtake. It was just, the strategy was always going to be a little bit up in the air. And so we just didn't know exactly what to expect. So, yep, all the ingredients there.
It wasn't only just a close qualifying session. I think it was the second closest qualifying session there has ever been, because only once has. So it was back in 1997, where at the Jerez Grand Prix, where it was Schumacher, Villeneuve, and Frentzen. All three of them were timed within 0.000 seconds of each other. And we've had that today. And Lando was within a couple of hundredths as well. So it was quite an impressive, amazing thing to see.
Okay, so for once, Matt, I think we can linger on qualifying. There's a little bit of controversy because Russell kept in the post-race interviews, he was like, oh, no, that toe probably cost me, if anything. And then every analyst did like a huge thing of how he got that toe and it helped him. My defense of Russell there would be getting out there and getting a toe in the position that it helps you, and then also making sure it doesn't ruin your lap when you go into the corners. That is also part of the skill of F1. So even if the toe got him the pole, like, well done, the toe got you the pole.
Yeah, well, one thing that I actually did, and I don't have the numbers to hand right now, but I actually went through and calculated what they call your perfect qualifying lap, where they take your 3 fastest sectors and put them together. And the thing I will say about qualifying, make any argument you want, but it came pretty close, except for Hamilton, to being pace order of perfect sectors. Russell was the fastest. Verstappen and Hamilton actually tied for the next 2. And then I think it was Norris. It was actually Piastri and Norris. So aside from Hamilton, it might have been a perfect qualifying session, but it gave us the pace order we should have seen on the grid.
Yeah, so I think that really set up the story of the race pretty well. So the problem we had in putting together the show, Matt, is we always go for the big ticket item. And I felt like the big ticket item was like the strategy, and it should just be an extended strategy corner. But it's actually quite hard to pick out what happened when. And so I almost feel like it's better to go, team by team here and ask, well, why did Russell lose that race? He started in pole, he didn't win. He could have won, maybe, or could he? How did he lose the race? That might be the best place to start.
Yeah, I think if we ask the big questions, the rest of the story will unfold itself as we go.
All right, well, then let's ask that question. So George Russell starts pole, and you could argue that the best qualifying car was still the Red Bull, or the best qualifying combination was Verstappen in that Red Bull. Verstappen made mistakes. I think a lot of the drivers made mistakes in that qualifying lap. So yes, part of it came down to who made the least mistakes, but I still feel like the Red Bull had the edge by the time we got to Saturday.
I disagree. I mean, far and away, Russell in Q2, which was the fastest of all the sessions for anyone, had the fastest lap. There was just no question about it. And I think what we saw that was interesting was both Mercedes with the new front wing, and importantly, with other aerodynamic updates, specifically front brake ducts and wishbones, coming onto speed. Like they are now genuinely there or thereabouts, at least in the conditions and the kind of track we saw at Montreal. I think it's a big step forward for them. And even Lewis, who wound up not having the best weekend, seemed pretty excited by how the car was doing when he had it working the way he wanted.
But if we get on to the race, so early on in the race, I will say that the start, which is something that normally throws up something to talk about, in a very interesting race, that was the most boring start I've ever seen. Like, Brad, you're the only one to have sort of driven in anger in race cars in the wet. But this seemed like, because it was wetter than the inters, so they probably needed something in between the inters and the wets, they were all being so well behaved on the first lap. It was really odd.
Yeah, I mean, there was some action. I think it was Perez and Gasly. The exit of turn 1 came together, so there was some incident. However, you're right. Considering how wet it was, they all were just being very, very cautious on the inters. And as we saw from the Haas pace, wets were the correct tyre for the conditions that the race started in. It just so happens that they all knew it was going to dry out soon enough that going for those wets actually would be the worst choice. I would always be an advocate for be on the correct tyres for the current conditions, because more often than not, you'll pull out a big enough gap if you're on the right tyres that you can stop and change anyway. But with track position here being pretty key, if you had gone and done that, say one of the front runners had gone off on wets and pulled a 10, 15 second gap, they were then still going to be back in the pack, stuck behind people on the inters. So there was no way of them being on the right tyres.
Absolutely. And you saw that with Hulkenberg, because he was able to, as his wets were degrading, trying to goal hang for a safety car at the beginning, he was able to hold them all behind him for quite a long time. The one guy who did make a good start, a good launch, was Lewis Hamilton, but unfortunately he got crowded out between it was Ricciardo and Alonso. He would have, his whole race, the complexion would have changed for him if he'd managed to jump those two at the start, which he would have done if he hadn't unfortunately gone for between them, which closed.
Oh, I want to count. I'm torn between countering that now and countering it later, because I do think there was a lot of room for improvement in Hamilton's position early on in the race, but it kind of got neutralised, I think, with the safety cars.
Yeah, so you had the two HAAS cars, I think was probably the most interesting talking point of the start then, because as you say, they were on the wet tyres, and Magnussen was making incredible progress. He made 7 places up in that first lap, up to P8. And then just kept going from there. And it looked like he was unstoppable for a while.
Matt?
Yeah, and this is where I want to talk about the strategy just a little bit. It was a genius move for where they were starting, for them to start on that tire. Now, it didn't work out for Hulkenberg as well as it worked out for Magnussen, who got, as you said, all the way up to P5. And they brought him in. So there were 2 potential parts of the strategy. They brought him in lap 8. To swap him onto the inters, which was a good crossover time. But they had a super long stop, and he wound up kicked back into, the teens when he exited. If he'd had a normally timed stop, he would have been back out in the top 10 on fresher tires than everybody around him. And this might have set up the second part of what could have worked for them, which we'll get to, I think, a little bit down the road. But it was frustrating, because from that moment on, they were just behind the 8 ball in their strategy.
It was ultimately frustrating. And to be honest, one of my missed apexes of the weekend, because they should have been prepared for that. That was what their strategy hinged on, was being ready for Magnussen to pit whenever the conditions changed enough. And when he said, right, I'm coming in, they weren't ready. What was that about? They should have had those tyres. They should have been sitting there with the blankets just ready to rip off and run straight out, but they weren't. It's very frustrating.
Yeah, that's what we say to the kids. You're quite welcome to drop in for lunch and then go away again. But if you don't call ahead, then I haven't got time to make your sandwich. So that was a driver call, though. But you'd still think, let's be ready for anything. In interchangeable conditions, we should be ready that drivers could come in. And it felt like all 4 tyres. It wasn't a case of one tyre running around. They literally just weren't ready for that stop at all.
No, exactly. And they should definitely have been ready for that, because that's exactly where the conditions were heading. It's what they were banking on, and they should have had those tyres ready. Yeah,
and he would have slotted in nicely on net behind Lewis Hamilton. So that would have been, whether or not they could have hung on or not, but it would have been a good story. But early on, I have to say, I have had a lot of criticism for Russell and his tyre wear. But I thought 2/3 into that first stint, I thought he's actually defending well here. I thought he was having a blinder. They were telling him to save the inter. He was having to drop his pace slow enough for Norris to catch up, but he was holding Verstappen off, Brad. And I really felt like, this could be like a turning point. All that criticism of Norris is by the by, and he's really doing it. It's the real deal. He's holding off Max Verstappen. He's saving in the places he has to save, and he's able to race. And just for a moment, like, it really looked in that first stint like he might be able to win.
Until Norris started to come on really strong, and then obviously overtook Verstappen and made his made his claim on the race, I thought Russell was looking relatively fine. Like, even if Verstappen did come back at him a bit, just the nature of the track being wet offline meant that Russell looked quite comfortable just sitting there at the pace he was going. Verstappen couldn't really make a mark. What was surprising was how easily Norris came along and drove past effectively. And if I'm not misremembering, Norris went straight past Verstappen on one lap, and then the very next lap did an identical thing to Russell and made it look quite easy. So I don't know whether there was a setup compromise that McLaren had gone for that meant they had a little bit better top speed. The Mercedes never looked particularly great at the end of the straights. Certainly Hamilton's car didn't. It never looked like he could make any inroads even with the DRS open. But yeah, just to back to your point, it did look to me like Russell had everything covered until Norris came along.
He did, and it must have been very difficult for George to have gauged what the ultimate pace should have been, because when you're chasing, you can conserve tyres by going a little bit slower, but still managing a gap. Whereas if you're in front, you have to set the gap yourself or set the pace yourself for others to then jump off. Brad, I don't know if you've done that in your racing and finding when you're in front, it's much harder to work out where the limits are compared to if you're following someone.
So always easier to be the car chasing, for sure. And I think in this particular instance, I don't think Russell was expecting Norris to come on quite as strongly as he did. And then obviously when that move happened and he then made a mistake and cut the first corner, that's when it really started to fall apart. And actually that was the first of several mistakes from Russell, which cost him at least a chance at P2, even if we could maybe agree that the win wasn't on once Norris had got ahead.
Yeah, I think Norris would have had ultimate pace over him in the end, barring mistakes and safety cars and that sort of thing. But it's impressive that the Mercedes has been able to catch up in their development race to be in that fight, because we weren't talking about them in the same breath in the last couple of races.
All I'd say on that one is, at this particular track, I'd really like to see whether this continues remotely once we get to a track with higher speed corners, because I don't think I'm ready to hold on to that hope very closely just yet. I think I'll feel very burned if I believe this performance is real.
Yeah, and it's for the Red Bulls as well, because they are struggling a lot on the street circuits or bumpy circuits where they have to ride the curbs. So we've had a few in a row, Imola and Monaco and now Canada, where those track characteristics have not suited the Red Bull. I think once we maybe head back towards the more traditional flowing circuits, we might, like Barcelona in the next couple of weeks' time, we might be in for a surprise of them jumping back ahead of the field.
I feel like we've had a little early to mid-season treat, and we're going to be back to normality pretty soon.
I'm going to slightly disagree with you based on the performance of the McLaren, even at tracks like Miami, which are technically a street track, but which I think surface-wise tend to play out more like a flowing track. And specifically here in Montreal, they resurfaced the whole track. So bumps were never an issue. Curbs were an issue for them, but curbs will be an issue on any real track at all, because you want to use, as Brad has taught me, you want to use every last bit of real estate you can to get maximum lap time. But what I want to bring up here is the interesting thing to me is that Russell had a mistake on lap 15 and Max caught up to his gearbox, but it was Max on lap 17 that had the big mistake that brought Norris back into it, because Norris had dropped pretty far off and he was at that point catching them at almost 2 seconds a lap. Norris had unbelievable pace in the heavy McLaren on those tires with whatever whatever magic wand they waved over his car before they sent it out there. Russell was never going to stop Norris. He had too much of a pace advantage at that point in the race. But I think you're right. Winding up behind Verstappen as well doomed him to third at best.
Can I put my tinfoil hat on for a moment?
Of course.
Excellent. Did anybody else hear, as Lando was driving past, that his car made an unusually high-pitched whine and nobody else's car did? And yet he was one who had quite a lot of top line speed. And even Piastri's car wasn't making this noise. So I wonder what Lando's got on his car that, first of all, Piastri doesn't, and nobody else does either. It was, once you heard it, it was quite obvious.
Extra turbo. Double secret turbo.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Now, the turbo noise is likely to be increased with moisture in the air, but the fact that it was only happening to that one car and it was on most exterior camera angles, it just tickled me a little bit. So it'll be interesting to see if anything comes to light with that. Okay,
so we're still sort of vaguely on why didn't Russell win? And I think the easiest explanation will be that that McLaren and Red Bull had stronger race pace, and that would be fair if we look at the whole season. So it would be unfair to go, well, he got pole, he should have hung on to it, and disregard the fact that Mercedes have been behind. However, the thing we've been saying about Russell versus Hamilton in race trim has generally been about saving his tyres. So here he was told, save your inters, and he had to lose a lot of lap time to be able to save his inters. Was good holding off Verstappen, Norris caught up. What really struck me was in the second stint, when this had already happened, the team had to be pushing him again to save the inters. And I guess he'd not picked that up from the first time. But I don't know. But I don't know if I'm being too harsh, Brad. But my hypothesis has been that he will just go out and use his tyres up in a stint and then hope to get new tyres, or hope that the race will come to him, or be on harder tyres and hope for a safety car. Here in this race-winning position, he still seemed to be going out and using up all the tyres compared to Norris and Verstappen.
I don't disagree with you. I think it's difficult to read into it massively.
Yes, I agree, yeah.
on inters on a changeable track, because a lot will be down to how much tyre cooling he's doing, what kind of, I was going to say pace he's been set by the team, but there's not really a target lap time when the track's changing that quickly. I did notice Verstappen was doing a significant amount of tyre cooling behind in places where Russell sometimes wasn't. But again, that's the advantage you get from being the second car in the row. You get to judge how much you do it based on the car in front. If you can move offline, cool your tyres a bit, and you can see you're sticking with that car ahead, and especially when you're not under threat from being overtaken yourself, then that's a luxury you're afforded just by being in the second position. Russell, as we mentioned earlier, was the one dictating the pace, and it's tough to know just how hard to push. So although I do agree with you, Russell does traditionally go out and use up his tyres more at the beginning of a stint. I don't know if that's necessarily what happened today. It may well have been, and yeah, it's something that seems to happen. We see him; he's a brilliant qualifier, but I'm unconvinced on race pace so far.
Okay, so let's move on to more tangible things like assigning blame.
Whose fault is it?
So George Russell was involved in one bit of contact, but that gives us an excuse to talk about some of the racing he was involved in general. So let's be fair, George Russell made headlines today. So he went out there and he scored the pole, which was absolutely fantastic. And the pole was on his banker lap on used tyres in the right conditions. He made it happen when it counted. So he had two racing incidents. One was a collision at turn 13 with Piastri, where I think he was defending in that instance, and then finally the overtake for the podium. So the Piastri incident, I think, is a classic one we have here on Missed Apex podcast. I'm getting a blank look from Brad, so can he not remember it? Is that what's happening here?
So the only Piastri contact I remember is when Russell was attacking rather than defending.
Fair enough.
He was trying to go around the outside of the final corner, and just. He previously, on the lap before, I believe, it might have been 2 laps before, I think it was directly before, he got a really good run on Piastri down the back straight. But he, unfortunately, was attacking a Piastri who also had DRS at that point.
That's
so
right, yeah.
The run he got petered out towards the end. So he gave up, slotted back in, and continued for the next lap. It then seemed like he got a little bit desperate on the lap where they made contact, because he got a run not as good as previously. He wasn't as close on the exit of the hairpin at the beginning of the straight. He didn't have, Piastri didn't have DRS, so Russell got a run around the outside, but hadn't pulled sufficiently far enough alongside to overtake around the outside of a tight right-hander, and then tried to, what looked like from all the views I've seen, kind of just drive through Piastri to the apex. And as we know from the racing rules in the last couple of years, the car on the inside tends to have the high ground in all these situations. So although I've seen people argue Russell was ahead turning in or towards the apex, all that does is afford him the right not to be run off the track by Piastri. It doesn't afford him the right to the corner for himself. So even by being ahead, the driver on the outside is still at a disadvantage in terms of the driving rules. And I don't think Piastri could have done anything different. He was squeezed up against the inside, and Russell obviously then took to the runoff area to avoid major contact.
So what you're saying is Perez shouldn't have turned in on Magnussen in Monaco.
Yeah, I think I do agree with you on that.
Okay, good.
Anyway. But essentially, I was shouting at the TV saying, "What are you doing, George? That wasn't on. Why not just wait until you have a clear move where you actually can get through?"
It's such an awkward corner, that one, because, and yes, I'm drawing on my vast iRacing experience, but those kind of safety chicanes, it's so difficult to concede enough racing room on the right hand side, say for that right hander, so if it's a right left, and then also pick up your point on the left-hand side without losing loads of time. Because generally what happens is if you concede room on the first corner of those chicanes, you'll just get nerfed off on the other side, or you won't be able to make that corner.
Yeah, I think I know what you're saying. There's basically no room for the car on the inside to give the attacking car sufficient room to stay on the track, because the corner happens so fast. There's a very tight right, immediately followed by a very tight left. One line through normally, even if you're on the racing line, you can only just about get through it at any kind of real speed, even if you take the ideal line. So by being squeezed up against the inside, I don't think you could argue Piastri ran Russell wide. I think the only thing you can say from watching that incident is Russell took a huge risk trying to go around a car that he wasn't very much past. The car on the inside has the high ground and has the shorter line to take. It's just how the physics of these situations work. And so for Russell to have expected Piastri to back out of that, he would have needed to be another half a car length further past. And then I think we would have seen it play out differently. But ultimately, I think that incident cost Russell his shot at P2 in the race, because he then fell behind Hamilton and had to repass Hamilton. And, by that time, he'd lost the time. And I think at the end of the race, he was only 0.4 of a second behind Norris across the line. So that certainly, by those figures, meant he had a very, very good chance of taking P2 without that.
One of the interesting...
Go on, Catman.
I was just going to add very briefly that the fact that he was so close to Norris at the end is why he kept that podium, and rather than Hamilton getting it back, because they both had DRS on the last lap, whereas Hamilton was gearing up with all of his saved energy to attack him back on the final lap, but Russell managed to get the DRS back again.
The one last point I just want to make about that Russell incident with Piastri is, if you want to know what the F1 drivers think of that move and whether or not it was on, all you had to do was look at the reaction of Max and Lando and George in the cool down room afterwards. I took a screenshot of it. I think I've actually retweeted Tomo, where he took a good screenshot, and you just see George looking a bit embarrassed as they play the replay on the screen.
Yeah.
And you see Max staring at George like, ooh,
why did you do that?
Yeah. So anyway, take a look at that. I've also put it in our Missed Apex WhatsApp.
But I want that to be a positive for George Russell today, of how much he saw winning opportunities and how much he was going for it, because in his evolution as a future F1 world champion, he's now very clearly in that position where he's the number one driver. He's favored by the team. He's got a whole team behind him now, and he's going to have a young driver come in whilst he is the big dog. So this is crucial. Like, is Russell going to step up to it? And today, this weekend, in fact, you have to go, well, he really led from the front. And even if he made mistakes, even if the tyre wear preservation was an issue, look at those moves. And, he went for it with Piastri, whether or not it was, good enough or not. And I'd rather have someone die trying when it comes to motorsport, figuratively, not literally, of course. But the overtake on Lewis Hamilton, I think, was actually quite quite fantastic. And I think he actually caught Lewis Hamilton out, and Lewis Hamilton was being relatively conservative on the defence and put him in a position where he said, well, no one's going to overtake from there, Chris. You know, you put him in that situation of going, well, I've pushed you far enough off. You're obviously not going to keep your foot in, offline, in the wet, with no space to breathe. And Russell just went, no, I'm going to do it.
Yeah, that was it. You know, there was so many puddles down that back straight on the inside that Hamilton probably left enough room to go, well, he's not daft enough to go down that side of me, surely, and I can defend him if he's on the outside. So, and it was millimeters between the two cars. If that had gone wrong, there would have been, first of all, a massive crash and also an international incident between the two afterwards.
Yeah, Rishi Sunak wouldn't have been able to leave that one early, would he? He wouldn't have. He'd have to have stayed for the whole thing. Brad?
I think the reason that move happened is because George was racing Lewis, and he races Lewis
as
hard as it's possible to race. He might not have gone for that had it been against someone else, but it was a decent move for sure, because exactly as you described, Lewis had pushed him already quite far to the inside. It was damp down the inside. You saw the spray flick up as George went for the move. He had a little bit of a moment, you know, a very slight wobble under braking. So the fact that he pulled it off was good. It was a really good move.
Yeah, it was a great move.
I would say that he races him almost as hard as Alonso races Hamilton.
Okay, good. So I wanted to sort of move on to Hamilton briefly, because there's quite a few issues around Hamilton's weekend. But yeah, that was one of my standout things, which is when Hamilton eventually ended up ahead of Alonso after the pit stop, and well done Mercedes for pulling off an overtake in a pit stop, for one thing. He pulled something like 18 seconds ahead of Alonso. So Hamilton was quite a bit faster than Alonso, but Alonso, it seemed he didn't care what was coming up behind. He didn't care what the consequences of losing ground to Piastri were. He really zoned in early on of like, no, I will defend Hamilton at any cost, even though it was so clearly not a position he was going to hold from lap 6. I'm not saying don't go racing, but had those safety cars not intervened, he would have lost position to cars behind as well. And it is funny that drivers do race different drivers differently. And so Hamilton is a victim of his success in that way. So Russell 100% races Hamilton differently than he would race another driver. And Alonso has basically a 20-year PTSD from 2007. So happy enough to move on then, because I think the next person who we say, why didn't they win, was Lando Norris. Sorry, Catman. I know you're a big McLaren stan and therefore by default a Norris fan. But I feel like in damp conditions, Norris had the faster car today.
Absolutely. No, he was absolutely on fire. It was quite amazing to see how quickly he could catch them, whether that was because he preserved his intermediates and was hanging back whilst Max and George out front were duking it out, and he was just able to then apply the pressure when he needed to, when the changeable conditions were coming. That's certainly possible. But throughout the whole weekend, he looked like his car was fairly nailed on. It was able to turn in sharply when he wanted it to. So he was able to put in those fast laps all the way through.
It seemed to me that the McLaren and Norris in particular, they were particularly fast in the very specific track condition of when it's nearly too dry for inters. Like that's what it looked like. When it was fully dry later on, even with a tyre advantage, fresher tyres, I think he had 2 to 3 lap newer tyres than Verstappen, Norris couldn't really make an impact on the dries. But in that phase where they were all on worn inters and it was nearly too dry for them, that's when they really shone.
And see, the thing for me is he had the type of advantage at the end on tires that you normally expect to work for you. But I think I might argue in these conditions, having the newer tires didn't actually work for him at all. It actually was a disadvantage when he put those tires on. But to go back to the inters, the thing that struck me was that the McLaren was super fast at the start of the race when it was heavy on fuel. And what I think is...
Hang on, I'm just going to say Matt is struggling because there's a car outside his building pumping out bass, but don't worry about it. Just chat. We'll be okay.
It's making me just insane. But what I want to say about that as well, it's he had the speed. I think he made a mistake early on, but by the time he caught up to the two of them, he had those tires exactly where he wanted them. And neither one of them was going to hold him off for long. But I have a moment of tinfoil because it was really the mistake that Max made on lap 17 that brought Norris into range. And am I the only person who noticed that as soon as that happened, they enabled DRS for the next lap?
That is quite tinfoil hat. Come on. Well, we'll not entertain that. We'll go to sensible grown-up Chris Catman Turner.
Okay. Well, I would like to highlight the difference between Norris and Piastri in the same stint, because in that first sector, he was much faster, and through the first stint of the race, he'd gained 8 seconds on his teammate before he then even piled on more pressure to catch up with George and Max. So he was much faster through the race. We saw Piastri's pace a little later when he was starting to attack those two as well, but that's after Lando had managed to scamper off into the distance.
Okay, so it's really hard to kind of pick apart for the win here what happened at safety cars. So just trying to remember in my head, the first safety car was caused by Logan Sargent. The soon-to-be departed Logan Sargent. Oh, James Vowles. James Vowles hasn't confirmed it yet, except he definitely has. I love the way that James Vowles keeps accidentally confirming that Logan Sargent is out and that Sainz is in. And he sat there in front of TV people on TV and said, we are actively courting Carlos Sainz because we are different and brilliant now. We would never have garbage like we've had before. Jake, someone stop James Vowles because he keeps accidentally saying the completely correct, true thing that you're not supposed to say out loud. But in any case, trying to establish what happened, Logan Sargent nearly didn't hit the barrier in turn 6 early on, but he actually did. But then the second time, he had a proper crash, fulfilled the prophecy, and caused the safety car. At that point, Norris was ahead. Russell was second. Verstappen was third. Verstappen was second already.
Verstappen was second, Russell was third.
Okay. Oh, yes. So Verstappen had also got past George Russell also. So setting that scene, at that point, Norris looked like he was running away with it.
He'd made 4 seconds on that lap between overtaking them and the safety car coming out. So that was a huge gap he'd managed to pull, but that might well have been his undoing.
Yeah, so and that's really unlucky. So when that first safety car came out, the safety car came out exactly in between that gap. So I think not some drivers now who are used to being out ahead, I don't think Verstappen would have gone ahead and pulled a 6-second lap. Whereas Norris went, woohoo, I'm ahead, and just went for it. I think Russell as well, even if he had pace early on, he didn't use all of it. The fact that Norris pulled ahead, we don't see that anymore, Matt. We don't see drivers trying to pull that big lead, really. And then the thing is, even though it's a really small window, 4 or 5 seconds, you've increased the possibility of missing the safety car opportunity and then the cars behind you getting that safety car opportunity.
And this would be one of the things where if we just had a tiny bit more time, I would have really wanted to go back and see the onboards, because the radio conversation was certainly suggestive of they had time to decide to bring him in. But I also think I heard him say post-race, or someone analyzing it post-race, saying that really the time wasn't there to get him in the first time around. Catman.
So in the cool-down room and in the interviews with Martin on the podium, he had said that it was just unlucky timing and that he wasn't able to get there. But then in the interviews in the paddock afterwards, he changed his story because he'd had time to go and reflect and talk to his team. Said, we'd made a mistake.
Right.
We could have brought us in. We did have enough time to do it.
Okay. Right. I wondered that. So that was my big overhanging question, Matt, as to whether they did have time, because Red Bull's pit radio made it sound like the key factor was that he couldn't pit, and then the safety car picked him up, which cost him 6 seconds. But I wondered if they actually did have the opportunity to go in.
Well, yeah. And this is the interesting thing, looking at the radio transcripts. And like I said, not having seen it visually, you're never quite sure what to believe when someone says one thing and then transcripts that are auto-generated say another thing. But the argument was it was so close at that point to a slick tire crossover. And that's before the rain was starting again. So it's a question of, do we come in? And if we come in, what tires do we put on? And I think they just weren't able to resolve that question with Lando before they got there the first time. And maybe they thought they'd be okay. But as it was, he got that safety car at turn 8. And just like happened to Max in Miami, it gave Verstappen and Russell free rein to get back in front of him before he made it out of the pits.
Yeah, that tyre question was very quickly answered by Charles Leclerc, putting on the hard tyres when everybody else was on the inters, and was 6 seconds a sector slower than everybody else.
Oh, man. I mean, we can take a quick diversion to Ferrari, Matt, but was that the worst tyre call of the season?
No. Yes, I know. I say that to be provocative, and I provoked you. I'm so proud of myself.
I am provoked. Matt, I'll continue my being provoked. He lost a minute in 2 laps. That is the worst tyre call I can remember.
All right, so let me break it down for you, and I'll explain why it's not as bad as it seemed. First of all, that happened well after the Norris choice had to be made, so it was useless information in terms of discussing how McLaren threw away the race for the first time, because it was the second time they threw it away. The reason they put those tires on him is they had to stop his car in the pit lane and restart it to try and fix the power unit issue. It was an ERS issue that was plaguing him. And they decided, since Sainz was still on the track, let's put him on slicks and see if it's doable here. In other words, he was just a guinea pig for the one car that was still in the race, because he was already, stick a fork in him, he was already done at that point. Nothing was going to save his race, because they were already having so many other problems with the car. And yeah, if you just look at it in isolation, we're trying to save Charles's race. If those hard tires had worked, no more pit stops all the way to the end, maybe he gains track position later on when everybody pits. If it doesn't work, we have information for Carlos, and he's really not any worse off now than he was before he came in dead last or went out dead last because we had to stop his car.
Oh, man. Poor Ferrari. From last weekend, is that the rule now? If Charles Leclerc has any happiness whatsoever, the F1 gods now need to punish him going on, because they had no pace at all. And I do wonder whether they gambled on a wet weather setup, but then that also didn't, help them. Or were they just slow? And why?
Different questions. Were they just slow? Yeah, they were just slow. They got it completely wrong. Why? My best guess? Brand new track surface. No meaningful running in either of the free practices. And based on their historical data, they just guessed entirely wrong and had no time to fix it.
Okay, that brings us on to the second safety car, and I think we do actually have a whose fault is it here.
Whose fault is it?
And I think we can go to our driver pro, our seasoned driving instructor. Surely, Brad, the number one thing Carlos Sainz should have done in that situation was hold his brakes. Okay,
right. I was wondering which incident we were going to be talking about. So we're talking about when Sainz lost control and then Alex Albon was the victim of him rolling backwards across the track. So one thing Sainz could have done was jump on the brakes. The problem was he had cars going past him on both sides.
Right.
And when a car spins in front of you and you're a driver approaching that incident, if the car is rolling backwards off of the racing line, as Sainz was doing, you're going to assume they will continue doing that. And if Sainz had just jumped on the brakes, he would have just stopped his car broadside directly on the racing line. So yes, you hold the brakes in an incident where you spin, but not if it means you're going to block the track that cars are imminently about to drive onto. So in this particular instance, I think he wasn't wrong to let the car roll back. I don't think he realized Albon was behind him. I think it was just very unlucky. He essentially had to choose which cars he was going to have a crash with. And he hoped that the car rounds outside would get past if he even knew it was there.
It's definitely where your biases come in, because I'm not a Carlos Sainz fan. My recollection is that he was on the grass and then allowed himself to roll backwards across the length of the track. So I'm now going to have to rewatch that, Catman, because in my head that's what he did. He was across the grass and then he lifted the brakes to go, I'll show them, I'll get them.
Yeah, it wasn't well, if I'm going, I'm going to take you with me type of thing. No, as Brad said, if he'd put the brakes on, he would have stopped broadside on the racing line, which is never a good thing. But I don't think Alex Albon has watched Days of Thunder, because, you always go for the smoke where the incident was, because by the time you get there, the cars will have gone, He's not a Tom Cruise fan.
Does that translate to reality, Brad?
I've never seen Top Gun, something I should probably watch.
Days of Thunder. Did you say
Sorry, I thought I heard the word Maverick. I was actually just rewatching the incident with Sainz so I could give you really accurate feedback. And Sainz, by the time he was spinning, his momentum was carrying him backwards regardless. If he jumped, I actually think he did get on the brakes, if I'm honest. Watching it back now in real time as I'm talking to you, the rear of the car spins around. He doesn't go on the grass at all. So your memory was false of the incident.
Unreliable witness.
His front left tyre grazes the edge of the grass, but doesn't really.
He was on the grass. So he was on the grass. Okay, fine.
He certainly didn't come spinning across it. He spun on the track, and the momentum just carried him around. And it does actually look to me like he immediately jumps on the brakes. There just wasn't enough time for him to do anything else about it. There wasn't enough room to avoid all of the cars that were heading towards him. So just an unfortunate incident.
Okay, Catman.
There goes Brad ruining a good argument with facts.
Yeah. But I tell you what, no, it's true though. Like, we are all unreliable witnesses. So when you see it in the moment, it is so coloured by what you want to happen and your pre-existing. So Stuffy in the Monaco review said that, Ocon was basically trial by reputation. It was Stuffy, I think, who made that point. But it was. So I watched that incident and I was like, there's Ocon again. And then watching it back, I'm like, oh man, I'm going to have to apologise to Trumpets. Unbelievable. But in the moment, we are all unreliable witnesses. So this is why when people go, but the commentator said this. Oh, but the steward said this. Sometimes it's not till days later when you look at it away from all the context that you go, oh, right, that my brain lied to me.
So one other thing I'm just going to bring up with regards to whether or not he should have been on the brakes, because I think it's easier to blame him for this because he lost control of the car in the first place. Was that earlier on, do you remember the beautiful overtake Albon made on both Ricciardo and Ocon at the same time?
Okay, so we don't often do like overtake of the day, but wow, like me and my boy were just on the edge of our seats. In fact, we were looking at each other going, did we just see that? Did he just go outside, inside into turn 13? Brad, like, we're not wrong here. That was a special overtake.
So it was overtake of the day, but as was mentioned, certainly on the Sky commentary, he didn't intend to do the second one. He went past.
He had to.
His move on the inside was because he'd ended up, too fast at that point, didn't have enough grip, and had to get off the brakes and just go for the gap. He was only intending to overtake one car from everything I could see there. So fair play for pulling it off, and it was maybe overtake of the season so far.
I'm kind of mad for you for even ruining that slightly. I think you should have pretended.
It's just, I could see it at the time. In the replays, it became more obvious. The commentary team picked up on it too. But he judged it really, really well, even if half of it was by mistake.
No, I will say, Brad, so from my dazzling racing career, there are quite a lot of times where you have no intention of doing an overtake at all, and then you find yourself in the corner and you go, oh no, I'm in an overtake, and you're basically avoiding a crash.
And when it's slippery like this and you've got different condition on different lines, sometimes things can catch you out. So well done for him not crashing in that instance.
The reason I brought that up is going back through the radio calls and coming back to Sainz to sort of finish this topic. One of the things that I noticed in Ocon's radio, when they said, Albon's behind you, blah, 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 he said, I can't see a thing in my mirrors because of this spray. So in talking about signs and his awareness of who's behind him, it doesn't really surprise me that he wouldn't have been that aware of where Albon was at that moment.
Okay, so the final not on rails topic, I think, is, well, Verstappen did win this race. People didn't think he was going to win it. So we've rightly, I think, in races last year where he wasn't really having to do much and he could have raced 80% of what he did and still won, I'm reluctant to praise those races. But here, in a high attrition, high error race, I think he made less errors than the cars around him. So I think it's a praiseworthy performance, Matt.
Yeah, I mean, so from a point of view of Max's driving, this was the perfect goal-hanging race. He didn't have the pace early on. He had some kind of a suspension issue at some point, and he just sort of stayed there or thereabouts. But I still find myself frustrated with McLaren, one, for the first safety car, and not even realizing that maybe he could have just stayed out there and stayed in first place. We saw 3 cars stay out and be perfectly on pace. Could have done that. And then the second one, and this is something I want to talk to Brad about, because this is the secret advantage in the second safety car. Not the second safety car. In the second set of pit stops, McLaren goes for not a 1 lap, but a 2 lap overcut on Max. And they get out in front of him, but they can't stay there because they have no temperatures in their tires. And this is where I think they gave Max the advantage that let him win the race. And to be, again, to his credit, unlike a lot of other people, he kept it on the track and hung around till he had the advantage, and then he ruthlessly exploited it. Right. And it was lovely. But
the topic is Verstappen.
Yes.
Yeah, and you're basically saying, well, everybody else messed it up.
I am, because by letting him get those tires 2 laps warm, when McLaren came out, they were struggling a bit, I think, getting the mediums up to temperature, and there was a real risk of graining on that tire that Mario Isola talked about before the race. And I think that's what Norris ran into, going hard on that tire when it was still cold. I think he hit graining, and that's why he just didn't have the pace in that last stint that Max drove all the way to the finish and won on. And they mentioned it on Max's radio, like, oh, we're going to have an advantage here because we're going to have nice hot tires.
I mean, that is an interesting take. So you're essentially saying that you think Norris wasn't as spectacular on that stint when he came out just behind Max, because he was then pushing on cold tires, whereas Max had been out for a couple of laps, warm slicks, and whilst Norris was doing that overcut or attempted overcut. I'd argue that I hadn't really seen Norris have brilliant pace on slicks yet. And so really it could have just been that they weren't as good versus the Red Bull when they were on slicks. And in terms of that overcut, it did work because it got them 1 position back, didn't it? Or
yes.
He at least stayed ahead of Russell. And I think from my point of view, what it looked like was they just saw an opportunity where actually, no, we're still fast on this tire. Right now, although, yes, ideally, hot slicks would be brilliant, versus cars coming out of the pits on cold slicks that aren't at optimum, we're actually still going to be pretty quick. And then he went and set those 2 fastest laps of the race and did pull off the overcut, except for the pit exit. He made up the ground, and if it wasn't for a wet pit exit, then he would have got there first. He obviously just couldn't barrel out of the pits and into turn 1 quick enough to make it stick.
The only thing I would say about that is that he gained no extra time with that second lap, and he gave Max an extra lap to get those tires all the way into the window. And that was the point I was making.
Yeah, the thing is, I like Brad's point here, because going towards the end of the race, Max looked super comfortable. So they might have thought, well, our only hope is, well, we're better on the Inters, so let's just hope that the conditions are better for Inters right now, because if they happen to be better for slicks, we've lost out anyway.
Absolutely. And don't forget, all of these drivers behind him were just piling into the pits, coming out on cold, slick tires. They all had to get them warmed up on a damp track. Any one of the other 15 drivers that were there could have put it in a wall, but another safety car, Lando would have been able to pit under that one and be first. So I think it was a bit of a do or die move.
Yeah, I think it was. It wasn't bad. And I think things had been done way before in that race, and this is why it was such an interesting race because during various phases we thought, oh, Verstappen's lost his opportunity to catch Russell. Oh no, Russell's messed up and he's lost a place to Hamilton. Hamilton had offs as well. Lando Norris had an off into turn one, so it was a proper error generating race. Now I loved seeing the drivers and the teams challenged. So I think we were onto sort of any other business here. I don't normally drift into the broadcasting side of Formula One, but if you watched Sky, you would have seen 1997 Formula One champion and outspoken media pundit Jacques Villeneuve being invited to join the Sky team. And surely, even if you didn't watch the Sky broadcast, you will have heard his outspoken opinions on Daniel Ricciardo. So I think I'll get your opinion on this, Brad, because, you and I, obviously, we spout our opinions every bit as much as Jacques Villeneuve. But how come it seemed a lot meaner coming from Jacques Villeneuve on Sky Sports than, say, you and me sat here in our shed?
I think, first of all, it's on, international television and
around the world.
Clearly going to be quoted and retweeted. I mean, if I say something, mean or factual that could be construed as mean about a driver, Ricciardo's probably not going to hear it, but Ricciardo definitely...
You were quoted by the national newspaper, The Express in the UK, for slagging off Sergio Perez, but it probably didn't get to Perez.
Yeah, probably not. Whereas Ricciardo did hear about what Villeneuve had said. It was clearly mentioned to him because he called him a rude name in an interview after qualifying. And Ricciardo did a really good job in qualifying. He was a 10th and a half off a pole, great. I think Villeneuve is just very, very happy to say exactly what he thinks. As we know, it was quite refreshing to see the Sky pundits under a bit of pressure to hear views like that and then deal with it and respond. That's probably the most entertaining thing about it. He also spoke about Stroll and was questioning whether or not he ever wanted to be an F1 driver or whether it was just that his dad had kind of pushed him in that direction. So I don't know whether I want Villeneuve at every single race. I'm not his biggest fan.
No. Yeah. So
I also didn't totally disagree with some of the things he was saying.
No, so I mean, he really went in hard on Ricciardo, which was like, if you look at the last 5 years, why is he still in F1? It's been disappointment after disappointment, and most people would agree with that. But then he basically went on to say, and the rest of his career has been kind of rubbish as well. Slated the Vettel battle and when he was up against Verstappen too, which opened it up for people to have legitimate arguments against. But I mean, what he was saying about the 5 years and perhaps his persona being what keeps him in F1, I don't entirely disagree with that. But also, I would take people who are in F1 because they're marketable, because we like them. I would take that over just paying 50 million to be a back of the grid team. So yeah, it just felt very savage on the world broadcast. Brad, then Catman.
So speaking of being savage, I actually want to be a little bit savage about a couple of drivers. I don't know whether I need to wait for later.
Oh, yeah. Well, why don't we go to Catman's opinion on this topic first, and then we'll let you be savage on some drivers because we're at that point of the show.
Well, I can't wait for that. But so with Ricciardo, I totally disagree with Villeneuve in the beginning part of his career because, as you rightly said, he did have some magic when he was at Red Bull. On the brakes, he was one of the best. He was one of the best overtakers. Go back to China 2018 or even 2015 when he was overtaking Ericsson, but he was supreme at overtaking people, slotting into gaps that just weren't there. He was fantastic. But when he moved away from Red Bull, he lost some of that support, some of that magic, and I think it was a big turning point in his career. But the problem for him now is, where does he land?
Yeah.
No top team is going to touch him because his form has been atrocious for 5 years. He's not even a safe pair of hands for a developing team like Williams because he's not consistent enough.
Yeah, so Villeneuve's main point was, I think if he wasn't likable and didn't have that charisma and marketability, he probably wouldn't have secured those contracts. However, that is a big part of the F1 game. So, He did do those things. He did secure those contracts, and that's why he's here and has a chance to prove himself. And then, of course, the very next session after Villeneuve makes those comments, he absolutely stonks in qualifying and ends up P5. And I think if you get that much criticism and then you pull off a P5 in like the 7th or 8th best car, you're entitled to go and tell him to eat lettuce, I think is what he said. But go on then, Brad. Well, here's some hot takes for the Daily Express. What do you want to say? Who do you want to attack? Philpot attacks.
So the first driver is going to be. This is a little bit too easy, but Logan Sargeant.
Right. Yeah.
But put it this way, my fiance, who she's not a F1 fan, but she can't help but know what's going on because it's one of the things I talk about a lot, and she's been with me for a long time.
Yeah,
and she walked in whilst I was watching the race today, and Sargeant crashed, and she said something along the lines of course, Sargeant was the first one to stick it in the wall. It's like, yes, he might not be in the easiest car to drive, but Albon's keeping it on the track. There are probably other cars which are also not easy. He's just demonstrating time after time that he's probably just not good enough to be an F1. It's really hard to drive F1 cars. Don't get me wrong. I'm certainly not claiming I do any better. And I think it's really, really difficult standard to achieve. And these are particularly difficult cars to drive. And it's damp, changeable conditions. Everything's difficult. But the fact is, everyone else was managing to keep it on the track. And he was the one car.
And that's not the first time that's been the case. Also, though, I would point out that your fiance is a terrible judge of character and content. Doesn't she always yell to turn off Missed Apex because she's sick of hearing my voice?
No, we were listening to you in the car today on our way to Caffeine and Machine. So, before I move on to my second driver that I want to start off, unless you want to talk about Sargeant first.
I think Matt and Catman want to get in.
Go for it.
No, I was just going to predict who his second one is. So we all know who that's going to be. So go for it, Matt.
Oh, no.
Well, someone has always got to say the unpopular and controversial thing, but help me out here. Was Logan Sargeant the only driver in the race to take themselves out by crashing into a wall?
No, he was definitely first.
And were they considered better drivers? Some of these other drivers who might have in Ferraris and Red Bulls taken themselves out.
All right, so we're all going to inevitably move on to Perez. Fine. I tried to delay it as long as possible. Brad, have at it. Fine. As the resident Perez fan, I could not be. I'm disappointed that he signed that contract. I'm sick of the situation as it's going. I can't believe that the situation is going to continue. I can't believe that he failed to make Q3 for the third meeting in a row. And then that horrible statistic, I don't know if it's you, Brad, that pointed it out, that Sargeant hasn't outqualified his teammate ever, but he has outqualified Perez 6 times. And you just go, so Brad, go for it. Look, my arms are open. My chest is bare. How about you?
So you certainly started it off for me. So you've made my initial point, which is that, Sargeant is not doing a great job. Perez is not doing a great job, but is sitting in a car that is capable of winning most of the races. And you could argue that the Red Bull wasn't the clear fastest car this weekend. I still think you could make a very good case that it was a very competitive car this weekend, yes. Unless you think the drivers in the McLarens and the Mercedes are complete mugs and that Verstappen is somehow, a god level who's just on a different plane to all the other drivers. Some people would make that
No, it was
case.
a good car. It's a good car.
But I think the Red Bull, when it's not streets ahead, I think you can be fooled into thinking, it's now not the best car. I don't think that's the case. I just think sometimes Max has to work harder than other races. Anyway, the car is inarguably one of the best, and Perez is absolutely wasting a seat in it. To not be able to make it through to Q2, let alone Q3, and the last couple of races, it's not just that he hasn't made it to Q3 or been second to Max's pole if Max is right at the front. It's that he's not even making it into the top 16. And then in the race, I took a glance at the timing tower about halfway through the race.
Wasn't making progress, no.
And he's still down in 16th, 17th position, having not really gone anywhere, and then makes a totally unforced error and spanks the car into the barriers on his own. So not only is he not capable of really doing the car justice, in conditions where the majority of drivers in lesser cars are keeping it on the track whilst going faster than him, even at the slow pace he's doing, he can't avoid an unforced error and put the car in the barriers in that car. So I just think it's really poor. I think when you've got someone like Hamilton absolutely beating himself up about the fact that he's being out-qualified by a couple of tenths by his teammate, and Hamilton is in a bad run.
Oh my God, it's continuing. Sure. Jesus, that's an even better point than the other points.
I think when someone is as far off of their teammate as Perez is, you really need to seriously ask questions about why he's signed this 1+1 or 2 year deal.
1+1. Okay, but apart from all of those things, it's quite a good weekend, Catman. Like, it was pretty solid. Like, consistent.
Perez was very consistent. You can definitely say that.
Consistent, Brad.
Yeah.
God, this is horrible. No, it's indefensible, isn't it? Like, where's the silver lining? There's no excuse. There's no mitigating circumstances. What's going on?
The silver lining is in Red Bull's pockets because he brings in more merchandising revenue than Max does, and that's why they've signed him on.
Do you think more than Max? Yeah. I've got Perez socks. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, and there's lots more Perez merch than there is Max merch, even though you could do lots of various things. But there's so many things for Perez, and it's unfortunate that he's unable to drag himself out of the quagmire of poor qualifying results. And what he used to be famous for at Racing Point was able to make the tires go much further. His race pace was what got him to Red Bull. He's shown none of that in the last season, to be honest.
Brad?
I think the point, I'll try and take up the opposing view here of what I think.
You're going to argue with yourself. Okay.
Yeah,
good.
I think the argument people will make is that Verstappen is just so good. He makes good drivers look bad. And actually, the Red Bull is a car that shouldn't be qualifying inside the top 16. Max is just dragging those performances out of it. I just don't think that's true. As much as I think Verstappen is really, really great, I don't think that's the answer here. So,
Trumpets.
All right. So, you know me. I'm going to go back to qualifying, and I happened to see a post-race interview with Perez, and they're like, what was the issue? Because that's the kind of question you ask someone when they don't get out of the first qualifying session in a Red Bull. And he says, we're going to have to go back and look at stuff. But he says, basically, the problem was I couldn't switch the tires on, meaning he couldn't figure out how to get the tires to the temperature they needed to be to give him the grip he needed to drive the car in a manner that it can be driven as demonstrated by Max. And I think we've seen this essentially as an ongoing problem. There's just sort of his driving style and Max's driving style aren't the friendliest. And it leaves him with a larger problem to solve when conditions get marginal, which they absolutely were in terms of track temperature and in terms of weather this particular weekend. And so you're going to get these results. And the kind of results you see where he crashes himself out. I mean, granted, getting hit by Gasly didn't help him much. But if you can't get your tires working in qualifying, where you have a whole lap to make them perfect, then in a race like that, you're just going to have these problems multiply. And the result isn't really that surprising to me. I think it's an issue for Red Bull engineers, perhaps, to also help him with.
I think it might actually be not only that, but also a psychology point of view as well, because, elite sport, we're talking about tiny fractions of percentages here. And if you just haven't got the confidence and you've had a few blows that every time you're like, oh, I'm going out in Q3 and Max is, absolutely winning every race last year. And you're kind of thinking, well, can I do this? Even though he's been at the top level of motorsport for many, many years, he is an excellent driver. But the relentless beatings that he's had from his teammate might well be starting to batter him down and make it hard for him to get back on that level.
Hello, we're organising something for the Saturday of the Silverstone weekend. So July 7th in Milton Keynes, we have a panel ready and we have a couple of venues lined up. We just need to know if any of you would be interested in turning up on the Saturday after qualifying around 8 p.m. somewhere in Milton Keynes. It'll have parking, it'll have drink, there'll be hotels nearby, and listening to a live panel. I think Brad's confirmed is coming. Stuffy will come along. We've got Kyle Power. Matt might fly over. We have various other Missed Apex panel. But we just need to really know what level of interest there is so I know which venue to narrow down to and talk to. So if you're interested, spanners@missedapex.net, subject line UK meetup, and then just anything in the blurb. It can just hack away at the keys. It doesn't matter. I just need to know if you would be interested in coming. There'll be a small cover of maybe like 15 quid a head. And then we'll talk about whether people want food options or anything like that, or whether there's food nearby. But basically, we're willing to turn up with a microphone, meet up with people, do some content, hang out, as long as we don't lose too much money and people tell us in advance they'd want to come. So get emailing me now. If I get a positive response, I'll go ahead, I'll book a venue, and then I'll send out links, booking links for people to book and get in touch. Hope we see you at Silverstone. That wasn't bad. That was obviously at the Silverstone weekend, but at Milton Keynes. Milton Keynes is close to Silverstone. 30 minutes, Brad? 30 minutes drive from Silverstone?
Yeah, I mean, the top of Milton Keynes is closer than that, but the venues we were looking at, I think, were about 34 minutes door to door. So
yeah, Milton Keynes is like America. You can sort of just drive everywhere to it.
So I know Catman is camping at the track, but I think he said he was going to hike there.
Yeah,
he's a quick walker.
You can hitchhike in the UK.
Shall I?
It's accessible. The good thing is Toaster, which to anyone visiting the UK who's coming to Silverstone for the first time is the one that looks like it says Towcester. Milton Keynes is just straight south down the A5 from there. So really simple.
Yeah, and once you get into Milton Keynes, it's got a very New Yorky system. So you just hit a roundabout, turn left, and you'll hit the hotels that we're looking at. So Mats, people were asking about Alpine, believe it or not, unprovoked. They're saying there was some team orders.
No controversies I'm aware of this weekend.
Alpine has not hit my radar at all. So tell me what happened.
Well, this one came up post race, but obviously you had the issues at Monaco, and you had the decision to drop Ocon, or Ocon's decision to leave, or the agreement that would be best for everybody. This thing happens. And then you get into the race today, and you have Ocon being one of 3 people to skip the first safety car and being well ahead of his teammate. Then his teammate put on the tire way too soon for reasons I don't know, and driving off the track. But then the safety car, second one, brings them back together. And at the end of the race, you have Ocon, I think it was in 8th, and it was Ricciardo, and then it was Sainz and Albon, who then helpfully took themselves out of the equation. So you had essentially Ricciardo gets past Ocon at the end of the race, and you've got Gasly behind Ocon, and you're thinking 3 laps to go. This is certainly going to be interesting. And then the team tells Ocon he has to let Gasly through. And there was an immediate response that I can only describe as Gallic, followed by, fine, I'll do that so that I'm no longer known as someone who doesn't follow team orders, which he then proceeded to make that point post-race rather a lot. So the issue is, from his point of view, he said afterwards, there was no catching Ricciardo by either of us. So it felt like a bit of a ridiculous order. But I followed it anyway because I want people to know that I am a team player, despite what my team has said about me in the past 2 weeks.
Okay, no one else has an opinion on the Alpine stuff.
I'm happy that there's this kind of soap opera beef in the background. It's just good to have a few of these storylines running, for when there are boring weekends. That means we've still got something to think about. I love that the predicted intra-team fighting Alpine when they stuck Gasly and Ocon together has come true, and they do dislike each other, and it is just about beating the other one. And then you've got the team management having, favoring Gasly now and not liking Ocon. I love Ocon's kind of sarcastic, like, oh yeah, brilliant, or whatever it was he said on the radio afterwards, like sarcastically saying, yeah, that was really, really clever, wasn't it? I love the way he said, why? When they asked him to let Gasly through, and then he said, there's no chance, or something like that when they gave him the reason. I just love it. That's good to have, because Alpine, they've got no value to us in terms of competitiveness, although they both got points today, but really they're nowhere. So if they need to provide us some entertainment, and that is going to come from this situation playing out for the next 15 or so races.
I think it's like Podrick in Game of Thrones. Like, this is some real side character stuff. There'll be a few people who are like, oh, is Podrick going to be good as Brienne of Tarth's squire? But it doesn't affect the main plot, does it? Harsh, but I think fair. Onto the podium. I can see Matt looking offended. Withdraw. On to our awards then, but I will say that this was a race that I was anticipating so much, and I always say that the key to enjoying races is managing your expectations. And my expectations were absolutely through the roof for this weekend. As soon as I saw the weather report about a week and a half out, because I know a rainy Montreal will deliver something interesting, and it did. Yet I expected too much. So my expectations were still too high. And so I found myself going, it wasn't like the pure chaos that I wanted. But do you know what? It was good racing. And we had opportunities for cars to have a big delta, which is what you need in modern Formula One. So that Lando Norris coming through with a big tyre advantage, overtaking Verstappen, overtaking George Russell, and us all thinking, well, this is it. And then, lots of twists and turns with the strategy. And I think at the end of the day, the best car driver combination still won. And I think there were mistakes up and down the field that shuffled out the rest of the order. But I really, really needed that Canadian Grand Prix after Imola, after Monaco. So as an F1 fan and an F1 cheerleader, I'm very, very happy. So what we're going to do, crew, is we're going to give out our awards. So we're going to start with the good one so that we can end on a positive note. So now it's time for your thing of the weekend. Christopher Catman Turner, or as we sometimes call you, Chris 4, because, you came along after Chris Stevens, who's obviously Chris 1.
I didn't. I came along before. I was here before Mist Apex was formed, my friend.
So we pre-demoted you even when Chris Stevens came in. And then we had Christian Pedersen and Christina Lee Mace, who unfortunately have overtaken you. I'm so sorry that that's happened, but I think it would be prudent to demote you to Chris 5 just in case another Chris comes in.
Well, I've been demoted because Chris Fonseca in the chat is Chris 5, so now I'm Chris 6.
Yeah. Okay. Right. But you have a Twitter account, so at Catman F1.
I do.
Yeah. Go and follow Chris.
I very occasionally post slightly controversial things. Not that controversial, but slightly...
Hot takes. Your hot takes are as valid as anyone. And I'm going to put your personal phone number in the show notes. So, Matt, can you take a note of that so that we can all bug you about our vet problems?
Are we putting an ad for his veteran?
No, just his number. And remember,
just his personal
just remember,
phone? No worries.
Yeah, UK 0044 and then the number.
I got it from the WhatsApp. Don't worry.
Okay, cool. No problem.
Yeah. I'll do those when I'm actually not working as a vet. That's what I tend to do in my spare time.
Thanks for helping me with my cat. My cat had like a brain thing and he's now all wobbly. She's all wobbly and it's 5 days in and she's starting to walk a little bit better now. So fingers crossed. I didn't take your advice to just immediately euthanize now, ask questions later, which is your normal practice. But Catman, what was your thing of the weekend?
Well, I'm going to combine my thing of the weekend with my Missed Apex awards. I'm going to do both at the same time. So I'm going to start with the Missed Apex bit, which was Tsunoda, who had done an amazing strategy. He was on for a good finish. And then he decided to bin it.
Yeah.
And not only that, but then do the opposite of sides and keep his foot in and slide across the wet grass, nearly taking everybody out. So that was my Missed Apex. My thing of the weekend was Hulkenberg missing him by millimeters and then going, have I still got all my arms and legs looking around? Okay, yes, I have. Great, let's keep going. I just loved his reaction to missing him by centimeters. It was so funny.
Man. Okay, so can everybody else stick to the assigned brief, though, of doing the bad thing first so we can finish on a good thing? So, Brad Philpot. Brad, you are the best driver coach on the planet. You are so perceptive and there's a good mix of slightly mocking, but also straight to what I can do better to improve. And I think people should go and hire you as their sim coach or just hire you for a track day because you will absolutely enhance the driving experience for anyone who gets you to be their coach.
Or you could do what one of my favorite clients does, which is hire me for sim coaching. And then the very next day, go to that track in real life in their race car and do it there. So I was coaching at Silverstone this week with Natalie, who's racing in a couple of weeks' time. She's the FIA's disability director. And
she's a famous. You can say her full name. She's a famous.
Yeah, Natalie McGloin. She handed the trophy on the podium to Kimi Räikkönen at Silverstone a few years ago. Anyway, so that's really cool. But just to see the benefits of the sim driving and then see it translate directly into her real driving the very next day and talk about the same concepts that we've had time to really go over in detail on the sim with no pressure and no danger, and then go and put that into practice is awesome. So anyway, check out the race coach. You head to theracecoach.com and check out
the race coach. How have you got the URL theracecoach.com?
I just
that's cool.
Put it in and no one else had it. Okay, I'm the only one. I am the race coach.
That'll be in the show notes below. But Brad, I chickened out of a recent chance to drive some nice go-karts because I'm just in that exact time in my life where I'm briefly inexpendable to my family. So if I'd have died 10 years ago or in 10 years' time, it's not a problem. But in this specific period, I can't die yet. But in 4 or 5 years' time, I would love to absolutely have you please coach me in the sim in like a Clio Cup car, and then just go wild with the rest of the amateur driving world and smash around Brands Hatch.
Yeah, and to be fair to you, Spanish, you did actually drive the fast go-kart. We're talking about a different one.
Yeah,
but last year you came and drove a pretty fast go-kart and were quite competitive.
I was scared. Oh, no. But I was so scared of being hurt. I took life insurance out and incapacity insurance out before I did that. And then I chickened out of the really fast karts just because if I died doing go-karts, I would be in so much trouble at home that it wouldn't, there would be no peace in death. But who is your, back on that.
I was going to, but think of our numbers, man. Think of our numbers if you checked out like that.
Oh yeah, if I died karting, I'd think of the clicks. That'd be amazing. Brad, who had your thing of the weekend award?
Okay, so my thing of the weekend.
Oh no, we're doing mistake. Oh, I've done it the wrong way around, haven't I? Sorry, who missed the apex for you is what I should have done. I pressed the wrong button.
I can do it any way you want, but let's go for Ferrari, and that's my missed apex award. So I can end on a good one. So Ferrari, because right at the point of the season where it looked like maybe there was actually some kind of battle for the championship, they were within striking distance in at least the constructors, especially with Perez being Perez. But that all went nowhere, and suddenly it's worse than it was previously. They just had no pace. Hopefully they'll be a lot closer going forward. So anyway, Ferrari, my missed apex. Thing of the weekend, I think just this track is one of my favorite tracks. It's a little bit of an outlier. It doesn't have high speed corners. I've enjoyed watching races here since I was a little kid, and it feels familiar and a little bit like home. Yeah. And so Montreal, it's cool to go there. Hope we keep going.
Yeah, I always have a good impression of Montreal, and so Catman in fact saved us from my pressing the wrong button. You're ahead of your time, Catman. Matt, Trumpets, you can follow this order now by saying a bad thing, then a good thing. But firstly, people should follow you by going to @MattPT55.
That's a good place to look for me on almost any social except Facebook, where I'm Matt Trumpets.
All right. Tell us, who for you, Matt, was your missed apex and then your thing of the weekend?
It could be the same thing, but I'll make them different. My missed apex had to be Sauber. New rear wing and just no improve. I don't know what's happened to them the last 2 years, but it's just, I hate watching both drivers, but particularly Bottas, who we know in a good enough car can actually deliver halfway decent results, just be stuck pounding around well out of the points. Absolutely nothing to be done about it. And I hope they figure out what's going on and at least get to the point where they can be 11th and maybe 10th and score a point or two, because they're the only team that hasn't.
And I'm going to give my missed apex and thing of the weekend to the same driver and situation. Okay, but first of all, follow me @SpannersReady. I'm the best one. Oh, and also, if you've got this far, if you're 125 minutes into Missed Apex podcast, then maybe you'd consider supporting us. Patreon.com/Missed Apex. Just encourage us to keep doing this kind of thing. Encourage us to keep spending our time doing this kind of thing, and think about the fact that we can spend time organizing a event at Milton Keynes, and all we have to think about is not losing money. Like, we don't have to think about making money to go and do that event. And that's because the patrons say, hey, here's a bunch of cash. Please keep doing Missed Apex stuff. So patreon.com/Missed Apex. Join us in our Discord. So the thing that is getting both the Missed Apex and the Thing of the Weekend award for me is Piastri refusing the offer to be allowed to switch places with Lando Norris. I have never, ever seen this before. They said, do you think you've got the pace to go and catch Verstappen for the win? And he said, no, I'm going to worry about the race that I'm actually in, which is the car behind me. There is no other driver on the grid that would have said that. Every other driver on the grid would have gone, what? Yeah, no, I think definitely 100%. I've got a chance to go and catch Verstappen. So missed Apex because he could have put himself into second place, I think, at that time. But also Thing of the Weekend because what a brutally honest assessment, and the best possible thing for the team was for him to go, no, my battle is actually behind me.
I absolutely love that. Can I finish up with my good thing?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, of course.
My good thing of the weekend, and I thought about this a lot, has to be Kevin Magnussen on the full wets the first 3 laps of the race. That was just the best and so much fun. I hope it happens again, but I'm not going to hold my breath.
The redemption arc of that man has come around very quickly, hasn't it? From being the pariah, just about to get banned, everybody's calling him, they're turning up his door with pitchforks. All of a sudden today, they're all very happy that he gave us some amazing entertainment. And what a fantastic, as you said, first 5 laps from him. Excellent driving.
Yeah, and so all he has to do to win our love is to every single time do a great strategy that basically gets him from, where did he start? Like P13 up to P4? Yeah. Just do that every time, Kevin, and we're all on board. Thank you for listening to Missed Apex podcast. I hope you'll look in the show notes below for all the things that we've checked out. We'll see you for some midweek content. So wherever we see you next, work hard, be kind, and have fun. This was Missed Apex podcast.